Hey guys, I am going to read you a book by Roald Dahl called The Magic Finger. It's a very good book. I used to read it when I was little. Quite a big book, so it'll give whoever it is looking after you some time to do whatever they need to do. Okay? The farm next to us is owned by Mr. and Mrs. Gregg. The Greggs have two children, Philip and William. Sometimes I go over to their farm to play with them. I am a girl and I am 8 years old. Philip is also 8 years old, and William is 3 years older. He is 10. What? Oh, all right then. He is 11. Last week, something very funny happened to the Gregg family, and I am going to tell you about it as best I can. Now, the one thing that Mr. Gregg and his two sons loved more than anything else was to go hunting. Every Saturday morning, they would take their guns and go off into the woods to look for animals and birds to shoot. Even Philip, who was only 8 years old, had a gun of his own. I cannot stand hunting. I just can't stand it. It doesn't seem right to me that men and boys should kill animals just for the fun they get out of it. So I used to try to stop Philip and William from doing it. And every time I went over to their farm, I would do my best to talk them out of it. But they only laughed at me. I even said something about it once to Mr. Gregg, but he just walked past me as if I wasn't there. Then, one Saturday morning, I saw Philip and William coming across out of the woods with their father, and they were carrying a lovely young deer. And this made me so cross. And I started shouting at them. The boys laughed and made faces at me, and Mr. Gregg told me to go home and mind my P's and Q's. Well, that did it. I saw red, and before I was able to stop myself, I did something that I was never meant to do. And before I was able to stop myself, I put the magic finger on them. Oh dear. I even put it on Mrs. Gregg, who wasn't there. I put it on the whole Gregg family. For months, I had been telling myself that I would never put the magic finger upon anyone again. Not after what happened to my teacher, dear old Miss Winter. Poor Miss Winter. One day, we were in class, and she was teaching us spelling. "Stand up," she said to me, "and spell cat." "That's an easy one," I said. K-A-T. "You are a stupid little girl," Miss Winter said. "I'm not a stupid little girl," I cried. "I'm a very nice little girl." "Go and stand in the corner," Mrs. Winter said. And then I got cross. And I saw red, and I put the magic finger on Miss Winter, good and strong, almost at once. Guess what? Whiskers began to grow out of her face. They were long black whiskers, like the ones you see on cats, only much bigger. And how fast they grew, and before we had time to think, they were out to her ears. Of course, the whole class started screaming with laughter, and Miss Winter said, "Will you be so kind as to tell me what you find so madly funny, all of you?" And when she turned round to write on the whiteboard, I saw she had grown a tail as well, a huge, bushy tail. I cannot begin to tell you what happened after that. But if any one of you is wondering whether Mrs. Winter is quite all right again, the answer is no. She never will be. The magic finger is something I have been able to do my whole life. I can't tell you just how I do it, because I don't even know myself. But it always happens when I get cross and I see red. When I get very, very, very hot all over, and the tip of my forefinger on my right hand begins to tingle oh so terribly. And then suddenly a sort of flash comes out of me, a quick flash, like something electric. It jumps out and it touches the person who had made me cross. And after that, the magic finger is upon him or her, and things begin to happen. Well, the magic finger is now upon the whole of the Gregg family. And there was no taking it off again. And I ran home and I waited for things to happen. They happened fast. Now, I should tell you what those things were. I got the whole story from Philip and William the next morning after it was all over. In the afternoon of the very same day, I put the magic finger on the Gregg family. Mr. Gregg and Philip and William went out hunting once again, and this time they were going after wild ducks, so they headed towards the lake. In the first hour, they got 10 birds. The next hour, they got another 6. "What a day!" cried Mr. Gregg. "This is our best yet." And he was beside himself with joy. Just then, 4 more wild ducks flew over their heads, and they were flying very low and easy to hit. Bang, 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 bang went the guns, and the ducks flew on. "We missed," said Mr. Gregg. "That's funny." Then, to everyone's surprise, the 4 ducks turned round and came flying right back to the guns. "Hey," said Mr. Gregg, "what on earth are they doing? They're really asking for it this time." And he shot at them again, and so did the boys, and again they missed. Now Mr. Gregg got very red in the face. "It's the light," he said. "It's getting too dark to see. Let's go home." So they started for home, carrying with them 16 birds that they had shot before. But the 4 ducks would not leave them alone. They began flying around and around the hunters as they walked. Mr. Gregg did not like it one bit. "Be off!" he cried, and he shot at them many more times, but it was no good. He simply could not hit them. All the way home, those 4 ducks flew round the sky above their heads, and nothing could make them go away. Late that night, after Philip and William had gone to bed, Mr. Gregg went outside to get some wood for the fire. He was crossing the yard when all at once he heard the call of a wild duck in the sky, and he stopped and looked up. The night was very still. There was still a thin yellow moon over the trees, over the hills, and the sky was filled with stars. And then Mr. Gregg heard the noise of wings flying low over his head, and he saw the 4 ducks, dark against the night sky, flying very close together, and they were going round and round this house. Mr. Gregg forgot about the firewood, hurried back indoors. He was now quite afraid. He did not like what was going on, but there was nothing about it. But he said nothing about it to Mrs. Gregg. All he said was, "Come on, let's go to bed. I feel tired." And so they went to bed and slept. When the morning came, Mr. Gregg was the first to wake up. He opened his eyes, and he was about to put a hand for his watch to see the time, but his hand wouldn't come out. "That's funny," he said. "Where's my hand?" He laid still, wondering what was up. Maybe he had hurt his hand in some way. He tried the other hand, and that wouldn't come out either. He sat up. Then, for the first time, he saw what he looked like, and he gave a yell and jumped out of bed. Mrs. Gregg woke up, and when she saw Mr. Gregg standing on the floor, she gave a yell too, for now he was a tiny little man. Maybe as tall as a seat of a chair, but no taller. And where his arms had been, he had a pair of duck wings. But, cried Mrs. Gregg, going purple in the face. "My dear man, what happened to you?" "What's happened to both of us, you mean?" shouted Mr. Gregg. It was Mrs. Gregg's turn now to jump out of bed, and she ran to look at herself in the glass, but she was not tall enough to see into it. She was even smaller than Mr. Gregg. She, too, had got wings instead of arms. "Oh, oh, oh, oh," sobbed Mrs. Gregg. "This is the witch's work," cried Mr. Gregg, and both of them started running around the room, flapping their wings. A minute later, Philip and William burst in, and the same thing had happened to them. They had wings and no arms, and they were really tiny. They were about as big as robins. "Mama, Mama, Mama," chirped Philip. "Look, Mama, we can fly!" And they flew into the air. "Come down at once," said Mrs. Gregg. "You're much too high." But before she could say another word, Philip and William had flown right out of the window. Mr. and Mrs. Gregg ran to the window and looked out, and the 2 tiny boys were now high up in the sky. Then Mrs. Gregg and Mr. Gregg. "Do you think we could do that, my dear?" Mr. Gregg began to flap his wings hard, and all at once up he went. Then Mrs. Gregg did the same. "Help!" she cried as she started going up. "Save me!" "Come on," said Mr. Gregg. "Don't be afraid." So out of the window they flew, far up into the sky, and it did not take them long to catch up with Philip and William, and soon the whole family was flying round and round together. "Oh, isn't it lovely?" cried William. "I've always wanted to know what it feels like to be a bird." "Your wings are not getting tired, my dear, are they?" Mr. Gregg asked Mrs. Gregg. "Not at all," Mrs. Gregg said. "I could go on like this forever." "Hey, look down there," said Philip. "Somebody is walking in our garden." And they all looked down, and below them, in their own garden, they saw 4 enormous ducks. The ducks were as big as men, and what's more, they had great long arms like men instead of wings, and the ducks were walking in a line to the door of the Greggs' house, swinging their arms and holding their beaks high in the air. "Stop!" called the tiny Mr. Gregg, flying low over the ducks' heads. The ducks looked up and quacked, and the first one put out a hand and opened the door of the house and went in, and the others went in after him and then shut the door. The Greggs flew down and sat on the wall near the door, and Mrs. Gregg began to cry. Oh dear, she sobbed. "They have taken our house. What shall we do? We have no place to go." And even the boys began to cry a bit now. "We will be eaten by cats and foxes in the night," said Philip. "I want to sleep in my own bed," said William. "Now then," said Mr. Gregg. "Isn't any good crying. That won't help us. Shall I tell you what we are going to do?" "What?" they said. And Mr. Gregg looked at them and smiled. "We're going to build a nest." "A nest?" they said. "Can we do that?" "We must do that," said Mr. Gregg. "We've got to have somewhere to sleep. Now follow me." And they flew off to a tall tree, and right at the top of it, Mr. Gregg chose the place for the nest. "Now, we want sticks," he said. "Lots and lots of little sticks. Off you go, all of you, and find them and bring them back here." "But we have no hands," said Philip. "Then use your mouths, Mrs. Gregg." And the children flew off, and soon they were back, carrying sticks in their mouths. And Mr. Gregg took the sticks and started to build the nest. "More," he said. "I want more and more and more sticks. Keep going." And the nest began to grow. Mr. Gregg was very good at making the sticks stick together. After he said, "That's enough sticks. Now I want leaves and feathers and things like that to make the inside nice and soft." The building of the nest went on and on and on, and it took a long time. But at last it was finished. "Try it," said Mr. Gregg, hopping back. He was very pleased with his work. "Oh, isn't it lovely?" cried Mrs. Gregg, going in and sitting down. "I feel I might lay an egg any moment." And the others got in beside her. "How warm it is," said William. "And what fun to be living up so high," said Philip. "We may be small, but nobody can hurt us up here." "But what about food?" said Mrs. Gregg. "We haven't had a thing to eat all day." "That's right," Mr. Gregg said. "So we will fly back to the house, go in by the open window, and get a tin of biscuits when the ducks aren't looking." "Oh, we will be pecked to bits by those dirty great ducks," cried Miss Gregg. "We shall be very careful, my love," said Mr. Gregg, and off they went. But when they got to the house, they found all the windows and doors were closed. There was no way in. "Just look at that beastly duck cooking my stove," cried Mrs. Gregg as she flew past the kitchen window. "How dare she?" "And look at that one holding my lovely gun," shouted Mr. Gregg. "One of 'em's laying in my bed," cried William, looking into a top window. "And one of them is playing my electric train," cried Philip. Oh dear," said Mrs. Gregg. "They have taken our whole house and we shall never get it back. What are we going to eat?" "I will not eat worms," said Philip. "I would rather die." "Or slugs," said William. Mrs. Gregg took the 2 boys under her wings and hugged them. "Don't worry," she said. "I can mince it up very fine and you won't even know the difference. Lovely slug burgers, delicious worm burgers." Oh no, cried William. Never, said Philip. Disgusting, said Mr. Gregg. Just because we have wings, we do not have to eat bird food. We shall eat apples instead. Our tree is full of them. Come on. So off they flew to the apple tree. But to eat an apple without holding it in your hands is not an easy task. Every time you try to get your teeth into it, it just pushes it away. And in the end, they were able a few small bites each. And then it began to get dark. So they flew back up to the nest and lay down to sleep. It must have been about this time that I, back in my own house, picked up the telephone and tried to call Philip. I wanted to see if the family was all right. Hello, I said. Quack, said the voice at the other end. Who is it? I asked. Quack, quack. Philip, I said, is that you? Quack, 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 quack. Oh, stop it, I said. And then there came a funny noise. It was like a bird laughing. I put down the telephone quickly. Oh, that magic finger, I cried. What has it done to my friends? And that night, while Mr. and Mrs. Gregg and Philip and William were trying to get some sleep up in the high nest, a great wind began to blow, and the tree rocked from side to side, and everyone, even Mr. Gregg, was afraid that the nest might fall down. Then came the rain, and it rained and rained, and the water ran into the nest, and they all got as wet as they could be. Oh, it was a bad, bad night. At last the morning came, and with it the warm sun. Well, said Mrs. Gregg, thank goodness that's over. I never want to sleep in a nest again. And she got up and looked over the side. Help! She cried. Look down there. What is it, my love? Said Mr. Gregg, and he stood up and peeped over the side. And on the ground below stood the 4 enormous ducks as tall as men, and 3 of them were holding guns. One had Mr. Gregg's gun, one had Philip's gun, and one had William's gun. The guns were all pointing right up at the nest. No, called out Mr. and Mrs. Gregg, both together. Don't shoot, please don't shoot. Why not? Said one of the ducks. It was the one who wasn't holding the gun. You're always shooting us. But that's not the same, said Mr. Gregg. We're allowed to shoot ducks. Who allows you? Asked the duck. Well, we allow each other, said Mr. Gregg. Very nice, said the duck. And now we are going to allow each other to shoot you. I would have loved to have seen Mr. Gregg's face just then. Oh, please, cried Mrs. Gregg. My 2 little children are up here with us. You wouldn't shoot my children. Yesterday you shot my children, said the duck. You shot all 6 of mine. I'll never do it again, cried Mr. Gregg. Never, never. Do you really mean that? Asked the duck. I do mean it, said Mr. Gregg. I'll never shoot another duck as long as I live. Well, that's not good enough, said the ducks. What about deer? I'll do anything you say if only you put down those guns, cried Mr. Gregg. I'll never shoot another duck or another deer or anything else. I will give you my word on that. I will, said Mr. Gregg. Will you throw away your guns? Asked the duck. I will break them into tiny bits, said Mr. Gregg, and never again need to be afraid of me and my family. Very well, said the duck. You may now come down. And by the way, may I congratulate you on your nest. The first effort is very good. Mr. and Mrs. Gregg and Philip and William hopped out of the nest and flew down. And then all at once everything went black for their eyes, and they could not see, and at the same time a funny feeling came over them all, and they heard great wind blowing in their ears. And then the black before their eyes turned into blue and green and red and then to gold, and suddenly they were standing in lovely bright sunshine in their own garden, near their own house, and everything was back to normal once again. Our wings have gone, cried Mr. Gregg, and our arms have come back, and we're not tiny anymore, asked Mrs. Gregg. Oh, I'm so glad. Philip and William began dancing with joy. Then high above their heads they heard the call of wild ducks, and they looked up and they saw the 4 birds, lovely against the blue sky, flying very close together, heading back to the lake in the woods. It must have been about half an hour later that I myself came walking into the Greggs' garden. I'd come to see how things are going. I must admit I was expecting the worst. And at the gate, I stopped and stared. It was a very queer sight. In one corner, Mr. Gregg was smashing all 3 guns into tiny pieces with a huge hammer. And the other corner, Mrs. Gregg was placing beautiful flowers on 16 tiny mounds of soil, which I later learned were the graves of the ducks that had been shot the day before. And in the middle of the yard stood Philip and William, with a sack of their father's best barley beside them, and they were throwing. They were surrounded by ducks, doves, pigeons, sparrows, robins, larks, and many other kind of birds, eating the barley that the boys were scattering by the handful. Good morning, Mr. Gregg, I said. Mr. Gregg lowered his hammer and looked at me. My name is not Gregg any more, he said. In honour of my feathered friends, I have changed it from Gregg to Egg. I am Mrs. Egg, said Mrs. Gregg. What happened? I asked, and they seemed to have gone completely dotty, all 4 of them. Philip and William then began to tell me the whole story, and when they had finished, William said, Look, there's the nest. Can you see it? Right up in the top of the tree. That's where we sat last night. I built it all myself, Mr. Egg said proudly. Every stick of it. And if you don't believe us, Mrs. Egg said, just go in the house and take a look at the bathroom. It's a mess. They filled the tub up to the brim, Philip said. They must have been swimming around in the night, and feathers everywhere. Ducks like water, Mr. Egg said. I'm glad they had such a good time. Just then, from somewhere over the lake, there came a loud bang. Someone's shooting, I cried. That'll be Jim Cooper, Mr. Egg said. Him and these 3 boys. They're shooting mad. Those Coopers, the whole family. Suddenly, I started to see red. I got very hot all over, and the tip of my finger began to tingle most terribly, and I could feel the power building up and up inside me. I turned and started running towards the lake as fast as I could. Hey, Mr. Egg shouted. What's up? Where are you going? To find the Coopers, I called back. But why? You wait and see, I said. They'll be nesting in the trees tonight. Every one of them. The end. That was The Magic Finger. It was a very good book. I like The Magic Finger. So what I will do is I will maybe try and read some more books, and if you would like to watch them again, then they will be ready, and you can just ask your mum or dad or whoever's looking after you. Have a good day, take care, and be nice to your mum and your dad or whoever's looking after you. And just give them a minute now and then. Take care, bye.